Is Jacob Andrew Lord, and this is my final English presentation for Dr. Thigo's class at Tennessee Tech University. Anyways, to start off, about myself, I was born at the base of a mountain in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and for those of you who are familiar with Chattanooga, it's Signal Mountain. I was born at the Women's Pavilion on July 29th, 1997. And we all lived at the top of it. And my family was myself, my father, Jonathan Lord, my mother, Melinda Lord, and I also have a little sister, Kyra. Well, my father was a whitewater kayaker, and on January 24th, 2004, he was kayaking on a river that he was very familiar with and had done at least 300 times. And at the base of this particular set of rapids, there was a rock, and he was pinned underneath the rock and he drowned. It wasn't until February 28th, after weeks of searching for him, that one of his friends found his body after a massive search team had scoured the entire river. And he left behind all of us, and of course we were all devastated, but I can't even imagine how my mother must have felt trying to take care of these two kids. At his funeral, we all went to the same river, and at least the whole entire town came, and we all put candles into the river and sent them down in his honor. All of his friends from the kayaking clubs carried a wreath down the river as well for him. After that, I had to go to therapy as a little kid for quite a while to understand what death was and what that meant. And after that had happened, we ended up moving up to Ohio to be with family for the recovery process, which I believe was quite helpful in all of it. In Ohio, we lived on a gigantic Girl Scout reservation, and we knew the owners of it very, very well, so we had thousands of acres alone, and we got to play with our cousins in the trees and the woods, and we would just spend all day, every second we could, exploring this massive expanse of wilderness. And we were always the house to throw parties because we had the most room. And on March 7th, 2007, my mother got happily remarried to my current stepfather, Benjamin Isaacs. And I remember being the person to walk her down the aisle because I was the man of the house, and I had to give him my approval for them to get together, which of course I did, and he's a really good man and takes care of us very well. Once they got married, we moved to Hendersonville, Tennessee, where they currently live still, even though I go to college in Cookeville. As a kid, I went to an elementary school called Walton Ferry Elementary, and started there in the 4th grade, and I was just a normal kid. I would play on the monkey bars and watch kids on the swings and made all these friends, and it always confused me because I would look around and see all the kids with their parents playing whenever they would come and visit, and I mean, I wouldn't have a dad there, and everybody else is infatuated with theirs. At Hawkins Middle School, I sort of had a depressive episode. Played on the football team, and during practice I'd watch the dads play with their sons, throwing the football back and forth, and at games the fathers would always be on the sidelines cheering their sons on, and I got really sad because I didn't have any of that, me and my curly hair. So I ended up needing to go back to therapy to finally realize that because I missed out on this, I wasn't excluded from the team. I was still a huge part of it, and in fact, I was a starter for offense and defense throughout the entire season. And I was playing so much, and I'm running back and forth across the field so much, I nearly had an asthma attack. This time that I met the two people that mean the most in this world to me, perhaps. They're my best friends, Cole and Caleb. And we would spend every single second of spare time that we possibly had together. And we would go out into the woods and find different trails near our houses. And eventually we got into the hobby of building these massive forts and building and designing these crazy looking Robinson style houses out in the middle of the woods for all the neighborhood kids to play with. And eventually we got to the point where we loved these so much that we'd build fires out there and sleep out there overnight whenever we had the spare time to. And my friends never realized that I had depression, and I never took antidepressants either. I hated the thought of them, but I never let that show. I always put on a smile for everybody around me, even though on the inside I was still quite depressed. Depression never affected any of my personal relationships with my friends, and once we got into high school, Cole, Caleb, and I got even closer, and we got to know each other on a very personal level, and we all made it to the rank of Eagle Scout together through the same scouting program even. And freshman year was fine. Sophomore year, I got my first truck and drove a little faster than I'd like to admit, and probably could have killed myself looking back on it. And it wasn't until junior year that we started to have some problems. One of my friends started getting into drugs, and it really strained my relationship with them, and it strained it put a strain on all three of us. And my other friend and I got even closer because of this, and we were confused as to why he would even do this. Thankfully, he eventually got cleaned up and is now a proud EMT with the United States National Guard. I'm not quite sure what battalion he's in or what his graduation number was, but at that same time, I had been accepted into the United States Marine Corps. And it was a very conflicting time in my life, because at the same time I really wanted to go and experience what they had to experience and what they had to offer me, but everybody was telling me not to. And it made sense why they wanted me not to, because the job that they had for me was a heavy machine gunner carrying loads of ammo for all these people, and so that means that I was a bigger target. And it wasn't until I sat down and I was self-reflecting that I realized that's not even what would make me happy. What would make me happy, it was not going over and being shot at by somebody who hated me. And thankfully I was accepted into TTU to be a mechanical engineer. And I figured out that I wanted to be a mechanical engineer because I absolutely loved cars and anything automotive. And right now I drive a Hyundai Veloster Turbo that I actually have the privilege of racing whenever I feel like it. And my most recent race happened in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was part of an autocross event where we would all compete on this crazy looking loop-de-loop track for the best times, and I was part of the OEM Plus time group and was able to finish in 3 minutes and 47 seconds, which is really competitive for that specific auto class. As I look back through all of this information, I start to realize exactly how much in common that I have with my father that I never knew growing up. Well, for instance, we both love cars, and I didn't realize that until I'd told Mom about this after the track, and she was like, "Oh, your father was always on a car forum and talked to people on there all the time." When I learned how to play guitar, I figured out that he wanted to know how to play guitar, but sadly never did. And of course, as I mentioned, both of us are very avid outdoorsmen, and I remember one of my favorite trips with him ever was a 3-day canoe trip on our favorite river. And it's just strange to think about that I got all of these traits from him without ever growing up and being around him. And it's even weirder when all these people that I don't exactly know come up to me and they're like, "Oh my goodness, you're so much like your father. Hi, I'm blank. I was a very close friend of your dad's before he passed away." And it's just shocking to me because people have always said we look alike, and granted I'm not blonde anymore and I'm a lot taller, but I look at that picture and I realize, yeah, we do look very similar. And it's not just in looks, it's also in how people perceive us. How people look at us and say, "Oh, you are like your father in the aspect that you're smart, you're creative, you know what's going on." And it took me a very long time to realize just how many individual traits my dad and I share. Like, for instance, we're both quite smart, and everybody on my dad's side of the family is very smart, but he has more of a business mind, and being an engineer, I've got more of a mathematical mind. He was able to start at the very bottom of a corporate rung and work his way up to manager of an entire plant in Kentucky before he passed away. He was also a member of the scouting program, but he never made it to Eagle Scout like I did. Now, I've heard so many words used to describe him, and also these same people use these words to describe me, which is always somewhat of a shock to hear, because when I grew up around somebody that was not my biological father, and people often compare my biological father to me, but they also compare myself to my stepfather. And whenever they find out that my actual biological father passed away, they always say, "Oh, he was a great man." And I don't quite understand where that comes from. What is it that made him great? I wish that I could have gotten so much more time with him that I did, but is it all these things that they use to describe him? Is that why they think he's great? Or was there something that he did? Was there some way that he impacted the lives around him that made everybody realize that he was, in fact, a great man? And in conclusion to all of this, I just really hope that one day I can aspire to be as great as those who have come before me.